Hey team, it's Andre from High Performance Academy here, and welcome to our AMA Ask Me Anything, and it's exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to be here to answer your questions for at least as long as they keep coming or until I run out of the ability to speak. So great opportunity to put those questions into the chat. The team are going to get those through to me. We've already got a bunch of them in there, and what I'm going to do is try and go through a bit of a mix of questions from those who have been online for a while and asked their questions a while ago, and those that are coming in fresh. So if I don't get to your questions straight away, just be a little bit patient. I'm going to do my best. We've already got a bunch of questions, as I said, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. Now, for those who are maybe fresh to High Performance Academy, I thought I'll just take a minute or two out here at the start and give you a bit of insight into who we are and where we've come from and what High Performance Academy is all about. So we are streaming live to you today from Queenstown, which is in the South Island of New Zealand, and High Performance Academy is an online training school. Before I dive into what HPA is in a bit more detail though, I'll just rewind and give you a little bit of a glimpse into my history. Before we started High Performance Academy, which has been running now for about 10 years, I owned and ran a performance workshop based here in New Zealand called STM, or Speed Tech Motorsport. And basically we did just about everything. We're a full service workshop specializing in building and tuning performance engines, and my own personal passion has always been drag racing. So we'll jump across to my laptop screen for a moment. I'll just go quickly through a couple of the projects that I'm really proud of. The one on the screen at the moment is my old shop car. This is a Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 3. At the time we retired this car, it held the world record for the fastest Mitsubishi Evo four-wheel drive. It went as quick as 8.23 at 180 mile an hour. We used a 2-litre 4G63, still the factory cast iron block. The engine made 1166 wheel horsepower, running 54 psi of boost on methanol fuel, and it revved to 10,500 RPM. Another one I'm really proud of, this one is one we built for a customer. It's a Mitsubishi Evo 9. This was built to claim the late model Evo four-wheel drive record, and it did exactly that. At the time this was retired, it set that record with an 834 at 169.7 mile an hour. On this build we used a 2.2 litre stroked engine. It ran on a gasoline based fuel called VPQ16. On 42 psi of boost it made 1001 wheel horsepower and also revved to 10,500 RPM. Now, as far as the tuning goes, really the engine doesn't actually care what it's involved with, what it's actually powering. So a couple of examples here. This is a jet sprint boat that I was involved with the tuning of a number of years ago. This is powered by a Nissan VK56, 5.6 litre V8 with twin turbos on methanol fuel. Makes about 1200 horsepower. Unfortunately, I don't think I actually remembered to put the photo of the engine in this. Nope, I didn't. However, these boats only weigh about 500 kg, so power to weight ratio is insane, and on the water they'll do 0 to 60 mile an hour in about 2 seconds or less. They can also pull in excess of 6G in a corner, so they actually make just about any car look pretty silly. Lastly, just again to prove the engine doesn't care what it's been installed in, this is a Supermarine Spitfire replica that I was involved with the tuning of, again, a fair few years ago now. The owner couldn't quite stretch to the original Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, so instead it's powered by a 6.2 litre GM LS3, and it's controlled by a Link G4 Plus ECU. So the basics there of tuning and engine building, again, really go across the board. Now, to come back, during my time running STM, I got really frustrated with the cars that were coming into us to be tuned that had been built and tuned elsewhere, and usually it only took a drive around the block or maybe a look at the mapping in the ECU to realize whoever had previously tuned it had no idea of the basics or fundamentals behind engine tuning. And part of this, a big reason for this, is because there's no formal qualification path that you have to go down if you want to become an engine tuner. So it's very different compared to becoming a mechanic or maybe an electrician, for example, where there is an apprenticeship program you go through. So the problem with this is, of course, anyone with enough money to buy a dyno, or these days just to set up and do remote tuning or e-tuning, can set themselves up and call themselves a tuner, and the results are exactly what I was talking talking about. You'd see cars that drove horribly, cars and engines that didn't make the power that they potentially could, and of course there's always horror stories about engines that have been needlessly damaged by a tuner who didn't know what they're doing. Now, I do want to be careful here. Obviously there are some excellent tuners all around the world, but sadly they are far and away outnumbered by tuners doing horrible work, breaking engines and taking people's hard-earned money off them. This is really frustrating as well because it gives our industry a really bad name. So this is why High Performance Academy was founded, and we wanted to show that there's no magic when it comes to tuning. We've since moved on and now cover engine building, motorsport wiring, also race car setup, race driving, education, data analysis and fabrication topics. So we actually cover a huge range, but basically the same principle applies. There is no magic here when it comes to tuning, and it is something that anyone with a little bit of patience and an eye for detail can learn. High Performance Academy, as I mentioned, been in business now for over 10 years, and we've got about 100,000 members over that time from countries all around the world. We teach all of our courses via online video lessons that you can take from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This gives you the ability to learn at your own pace, and you can learn at your own place. I'll talk a little bit more about some of our courses as we go through this. I don't want to labor on about them now, and some of these questions that come through, maybe I'll be able to point you to some of our courses that I think would really cover your questions in a bit more detail. So let's get into our questions. Remember, if you've got more, please keep them coming. First question today comes from Nismo Freak, who's asked, I've got a strange question. I've got a stockish RB25/30 with RB26 ITBs or individual throttle bodies fitted. It refuses to idle or cruise anywhere near stoic without misfiring. It only wants to run at 12.5 to 1. Okay, I'm going to take a really educated guess here that your problem is that you have not balanced the throttle bodies. This is something that so many people overlook, yet it is so important. Now, what I mean by balance is essentially getting the throttle bodies so that they are all closed exactly the same amount. And this makes a really big difference at or just above idle. So you'll see this problem at idle and definitely at cruise. Once you get past about 30 or 40% throttle opening, it doesn't really have so much of an impact. So the engine will drive perfectly at higher throttle openings. So what's happening here is when the throttles are all closed particularly, you're likely to have 1, 2, or maybe even 3 or 4 throttle plates that are open more than the others. And what this does is it gives a very big differential airflow to some of the cylinders. Essentially, those where the throttle plates are cracked open further are getting more airflow. However, our injectors are all pulsing and delivering the same quantity of fuel on each cylinder, so you get this situation where you've got some cylinders that are running probably way too rich and others that are running way too lean. The actual air-fuel ratio that you're monitoring in the exhaust is simply the average of all 6 cylinders. So if that says it's okay, or in your case 12.5 to 1, that's the average. So you've probably got a couple of cylinders there that are very lean. So how do you fix this? Well, the ideal way is with a carb balancer. So this is a unit that actually goes into the intake trumpet, and it's got a little scale that shows the airflow through the trumpet, and you just adjust your throttle butterflies so that they're even across all 6. Another way you can do this, and I've done this before, if you've got a vacuum port on each of the inlet runners post throttle plate, you can use a vacuum gauge and just basically move it from one cylinder to the other and match that. So it's really, really common problem on any ITB setup. Getting this right should be the first part of your setup before you actually get into any of the tuning. Next question comes from Brad Butterworth, who's asked, could you discuss the pros and cons of digital or CAN bus versus analog? Okay, you haven't given a specific question around where and when one is better than the other, but let me dive into it. So CAN bus is something we're going to see basically on every aftermarket ECU and factory ECU now that's come out in the last probably 15 plus years. It's very, very common. And for those who haven't heard of it before, it is a way of sending and receiving messages from different electronic devices. And this is done over a simple 2-wire bus, which is a twisted pair of wires. So what it allows, the simplicity of it, the benefit of it is it allows a huge amount of data to be transferred backwards and forwards between all of the different electronic modules in your car. So if you're thinking about a factory car, this would include the gauge cluster, the engine control module, the transmission control module, maybe there'll be the ABS unit on that as well, and all of this information is being transmitted as required between these different units, and again, only requires 2 wires to do this. You can have a huge amount of data being transmitted. Benefits in the aftermarket world is that we can now send and receive data between modules of different manufacturers. So CAN bus, because it is a standardized communication protocol, we can use a Motec dash with maybe a Haltech ECU or a Haltech dash with a different ECU, it doesn't really matter. Likewise, we're now seeing if we want to get, for example, wideband air fuel ratio data or maybe exhaust gas temperature into the ECU. A few years ago, the way we would have done this would be to wire a controller up to an analog voltage input. And if we wanted to run 4 widebands, that would require 4 individual analog voltage inputs. If we want to run 4 EGTs, another 4 inputs. Instead now, a lot of these modules are coming out as CAN enabled, and we can run our EGTs into a little box, and then all we need to do is run power, ground, and then CAN high and low to that box, connect that to our ECU or our dash logger or whatever it may be, and we've got all of that data. So it greatly simplifies our wiring. It also means we don't need so much I/O on our ECUs or our dashes because we can get all of this data in via CAN messaging instead. The other real big benefit, and this is one of my favorite parts of CAN, is that the data integrity is guaranteed. So what I mean by this is, let's bring back the example of the wideband air fuel ratio meter. Conventionally, this would have been a 0 to 5 volt output from the controller that we then feed into the ECU. And depending on what the actual voltage is, that will then be scaled to air fuel ratio. The problem with this is that that sort of input is very, very prone to what we call a ground offset. So if our grounding isn't really robust and solid, we do have the potential that there will be a voltage offset or differential compared to what the unit's actually sending out. What this means is that we might be reading 12.5 to 1 air fuel ratio, but the actual air fuel ratio could be incorrect. It might actually be 12.8, and obviously that could be dangerous. CAN, on the other hand, because it is a digital signal, the integrity of that data is guaranteed. So if that signal is going through and it's saying 12.5 to 1, we know that that's accurate. So I could go on, but that probably gives you a reasonable idea about how that all works there, Brad. The Math Garage has jumped in on the docile bandwagon, asking what progress has been this week. Well, you'll be happy to know I actually went and looked at the car, so it's still there. No other progress, I'm afraid. Daniel has asked, can your pre-existing Motorsports Wiring harness work for different engine management systems, or do you have to build another harness for the new system? Unfortunately, yeah, it's not really that easy. The pinouts on the ECUs themselves, and more often even the connectors that the ECUs use, will be dramatically different. We've just gone through this with our own FD-RX7. We're in the process of changing from an Adaptronic ECU to a Fueltech FT600. Now, we had kind of planned this out though, because we've got the harness made so that we can then add in adapter harnesses to suit different ECUs. I would say, Daniel, that it would be usually pretty rare that we would actually want to change an ECU with an existing harness though. So this is a very rare problem to come across, but no, it's definitely not going to be that easy to solve, unfortunately. Question from Gabriel, who's asked, what benefits other than checking for turbo overspeeding will equipping a speed sensor to it? What are the bonuses here of having a turbo speed sensor on our turbo? So basically, we know from the turbo speed, it gives us another input that we can use to decide exactly whereabouts we're operating on the turbo compressor map. So the axes on our turbo compressor map, on the vertical axis will be pressure ratio, which is simply the compressor outlet pressure divided by the compressor inlet pressure. Subtle difference there. Most people think that this is just boost pressure, but you can end up quite common to see a reduction in the pressure at the inlet to the turbo, which has the effect for the same outlet pressure or boost pressure in our manifold of raising the pressure ratio. So pressure ratio is normally pretty easy for us to work out as long as we've got those two sensors fitted, pre and post compressor pressure. the horizontal axis is our corrected airflow in pounds per minute. Now that one's a little bit trickier to work out for us, so using turbo speed is another point. We'll have turbo speed lines that run across the compressor map islands, and we can use that and pressure ratio to work out really accurately exactly where we are operating on that compressor map. The other element which you said though is exactly correct here. Turbo speed, the maximum value which all of the manufacturers of turbos do give us, we need to be really careful when we're starting to push these turbos to their limits, because if we overspeed the turbo, it is going to result in failure. Now, another element here is that turbo speed can actually be utilized as an input to the boost control strategy as well on some more advanced ECUs. So a range of different uses. I would say that definitely at the street level or grassroots motorsport, it's definitely not an essential sensor. It's one of those nice to have but not essential to have. Just a quick note as well, if you're unsure how to read a turbo compressor map, it is something we cover in our members webinar lesson. This is number 107, which is analyzing turbo performance. You can check that out at hpacademy.com. I'll try and get the team to put a link to that webinar as well in the comments. Right, next question from Initial DIY Mods, newer VIP member here, welcome on board. I'm having some trouble fitting a sway bar from my 4G63 all-wheel drive swap R56 Mini Cooper. I run the car in rallycross and autocross and need some creative alternatives to OEM bars. Okay, it's an interesting swap, I've got to admit. I mean, really what you can do here is going to come down in a lot of instances to physically what you can fit in the car and where you can fit it. We've just gone through this process with our Toyota 86 endurance car, and we've made up blade adjustable anti-roll bars front and rear. What we've done with these to get room, because obviously a lot of the factory sway bars or anti-roll bars will be bent to sort of clearance different components, and that's quite difficult to do in something custom, and it's quite difficult to do if you don't have a lot of room. So we've actually mounted the anti-roll bars down below the chassis, but of course this then can become a clearance issue. So I'm not 100% sure what more I can give you here, but what I would say, since you're a VIP member, our suspension design and optimization course, there are modules in there covering anti-roll bar design, anti-roll bar rating, and there's a nice little formula cheat sheet in there that lets you actually work out approximately what the anti-roll bar stiffness is going to be before you actually ever go to the trouble of making one. So yeah, hopefully that's helped you, but I probably need a little bit more information to truly help you there. Welcome to the HPA crew there, also to Scott Marco, who has just purchased that suspension tuning and optimization course at 50% off. I should have mentioned as well, we are still running our Cyber Monday sale following on from Black Friday at the moment, and I think this only runs for another 24 hours or so. Every single course that we offer is currently 50% off. So if you want to check those out, you can go to hpacademy.com/courses. That will give you a full list of the courses we offer. And I will also mention as well, regardless whether it's a Cyber Monday sale or any other time, we offer a 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee. So if you purchase a course and decide it's not quite what you expected, no problem, let us know and we will give you a full refund of the purchase price. Tation has asked, for the upcoming transmission courses, will there be a variety in terms of types? Yeah, Tation, that is the intention. I can't say that we're going to cover every transmission out there. There's obviously a lot, but we will be covering the popular models from the likes of GM and the ones used in Ford as well. So for those who've got no idea what I'm talking about here, with modern computer-controlled automatic transmissions, there is actually a lot of control within the transmission control module of the shift speed, the shift points, and by optimizing these we can really have a great effect on the drivability of the car and how fast the car accelerates as well. And this is something I think a lot of people overlook. Back many years ago we had a demonstrator vehicle for my old business that was a VE Holden Commodore, basically Pontiac G8 for those of you in the US, so 6-litre LS2. I was at the drag strip and we went from running a 14.2 second quarter down to a 13.5, and so almost a full second off the ET, and the only changes I made in order to do that was sharpening up the shift speed. So there's a lot to be had there. So that course will be out next year. So thanks for your patience there. Next question comes from Delta Charlie Echo, who has asked, I'm in the very early stages of designing a M70B50 forged internals twin compound turbo setup for a proper time attack car in either a Z3 or a compact E36, including all-wheel drive and active aero. What should I be looking at from a standalone ECU to bench, build and tune this engine? Okay, I mean, it really depends how far you're going, but it sounds like you're going pretty extreme there. You're going to want to look at an ECU with proper motorsport functionality, particularly around the compound turbo setup. You may also be wanting to incorporate some custom features. So probably the two that would spring to mind here, three of them that would spring to mind that I think would suit your aims, would be the Cyvex range, which is essentially a consumer level life racing product. The Motec range, specifically here, the M1, and I'll get into why I mentioned that shortly, and then the M-Tron range as well. All three that I've mentioned, and I do apologize to other ECU manufacturers. I don't have an exhaustive list here. There are others that will almost certainly meet this criteria, but all three that I've just listed there are proper motorsport featured ECUs. Now, running your actual engine, that's not going to be too tricky with the sole caveat there of your compound twin turbo setup. Might be some tricky bits around there, but actually running the engine, fuel and ignition timing, that's not going to be very difficult. Anything will be able to do that. For time attack though, you're going to be wanting to look at sophisticated features like closed loop gear change control. Not sure if you're going paddle or lever shifted. That's really important for quick consistent shifts and also gearbox reliability. Probably also going to want to look at some traction control functionality as well. And there's vast differences between the traction control functionality at some of the lower price point ECUs and how that traction control functions works in these top level motorsport targeted ECUs. Now the other reason that I did suggest the Motec M1 range is because Motec are reasonably unique in that they offer M1 build as a product. It's where you can basically buy a license for your ECU, and if you're smart enough, or alternatively you can work with a developer, you can actually make your own features inside the ECU. The ECU becomes essentially a black box, and you can make your own firmware to do exactly what you want. That might be quite helpful with your active aero and your compound turbo setup. So hopefully that will give you some direction there. Now for those who are interested in tuning, just talking about that question there, obviously tuning becomes a key part here. A couple of courses that we do offer that would be really beneficial. We've got our EFI Tuning Fundamentals course, which will teach you, as you'd expect, the fundamentals of EFI tuning, teaches you how the ECU works and how the engine works, why an engine needs a specific amount of fuel and how it responds to ignition timing. We've got our Understanding Air-Fuel Ratio course, which, as its name implies, will teach you how the air-fuel ratio affects the engine operation. Probably one of the most common questions we get asked is, what air-fuel ratio should we run? This course answers that question, specifically teaching you how to test and find the correct air-fuel ratio for your engine and your application. Then lastly, our practical standalone tuning course, which gives you a nice, simple to follow 10-step process that you can apply to tuning any engine. Again, all of those courses 50% off, and I'll get the team to drop some links into the chat for those. Next question comes from Daniel Henkel, who's asked, when is it appropriate to alter your stock wiring to motorsport wiring? Okay, good question there, Daniel, and the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. Now, there's a wide range of builds and what people are going to be prepared to spend in terms of budget, and those two aspects, application and budget, are going to be a major driver. So at the very pointy end, where budget is absolutely no problem, of course, we would be stripping the car bare and running a complete new motorsport grade wiring harness, usually using high quality materials, the likes of Tefsol wire. It'll probably be concentrically twisted. We're likely to be using Autosport connectors, and the harness is probably going to be completely sealed using DR25 and heat molded boots. That, however, is an incredibly expensive and time-consuming way to build a harness, so it doesn't suit everyone, and it absolutely is not essential. You're seeing a lot of the modern crop of GT4 race cars that are manufacturer built are actually not even going this way, and these are cars built to compete effectively in endurance racing. At the other end, we might be lightly modifying an existing road car, in which case maybe we can work with the factory wiring. Now, the considerations that I keep in mind here are, first of all, what is the condition of the wiring? If you've got something that's reasonably late model, chances are the wiring is going to be absolutely fine. But I did a lot of work dealing with older, the likes of maybe Nissan SR20, RB26 powered cars, and the wiring harnesses in those, because they are now getting on a little bit, generally had taken a bit of a pounding from the heat. So really common on those cars, for example, when you take the coils off, the plugs often, the connector bodies actually break because they've been sitting there getting cooked over the years, but the heat between the rocker covers and the plastic actually degrades and breaks. So if you've got a wiring harness that's questionable, again, obviously that would be a good place to start again and build a new harness. But there are club level harnesses as well that aren't going to break the bank. They don't need to be concentrically twisted. You don't need to be using Autosport connectors. So those are the things you need to be considering. The other element of whether we can work with a factory existing harness would be, what modifications are we making? So if you're using a plug-and-play ECU and your wiring harness is in good condition, well, that's probably absolutely fine. But you might also find that maybe you want to run a set of secondary injectors, another set of 4 or 6 injectors, depending on how many cylinders you've got, to add additional fuel. Maybe you're going to want to start adding some additional sensors for fuel pressure, oil pressure, exhaust back pressure, turbo speed, the list goes on. At that point, it can be sort of difficult to integrate all of those additional sensors with the factory harness, and at that point going to something standalone and bespoke makes a bit more sense. It also allows you to strip out all of the unnecessary wiring, particularly if you're building a race car, and really simplify the loom and make it a lot neater. And again, a few courses that we do have in there that would suit you, Daniel, if you do want to learn more about that. We have our wiring fundamentals course. Again, pretty self-explanatory there, but I do find that a lot of enthusiasts who are prepared to just about take on any task with their own project builds tend to shy away from the wiring, and I think a lot of that comes down to we can't see voltage, current, and resistance. The reality is it's not too tricky here, and again, just like everything we teach, if you've got an eye for detail and a bit of patience, you can absolutely learn to make a high-quality wiring harness. Moving on from the wiring fundamentals course, we've got our club level course. That is intended to help you build club level harnesses for maybe a modified street car, grassroots, or semi-professional motorsports. So cost-effective tooling, cost-effective materials. It's not going to break the bank. You'll still be able to build a quality, reliable harness. If you want to go the whole hog though, we've got our practical professional motorsport harness construction course. That'll teach you how to build concentrically twisted harnesses, how to work with Autosport connectors, etc. Again, the team will put a link into the chat with those, and we've got that 50% off deal for Cyber Monday. On that note, welcome to the HPA crew to Rodney Shaw, join us from the US, who has just bought that practical wiring professional motorsport harness construction course at 50% off. We know you're going to love that course, Rodney. Next question comes from Hong, who's asked, what kind of devices do you use for the CAN bus reverse engineering? Okay, so this is a pretty specialized skill, but it is becoming more common these days as more and more cars obviously start to get modified that have factory CAN buses. So what is reverse engineering, first of all, for those who have never heard this term? Basically what it is getting access to the CAN bus and looking at the messages on the bus and then figuring out what they are. So for example, I talked earlier about a CAN-based wideband controller. So when that's sending information out, it's not sending a nice, easy to read number that we'll see on the CAN bus of 12.5 to 1 air-fuel ratio. Instead, that will be sent as a message that is basically a set of bits and bytes, and then the receiving unit knows whereabouts, what address to look for that particular information, and how to decode what the actual bits mean so it can turn it back into something sensible that it can read. So specifically for your question, what you're going to need is a device called a CAN sniffer. There's a number of these out there. Some ECUs now actually have built-in CAN sniffers, so that makes it nice and easy. We've got one built into our mainline dyno. Max ECU is another one that's got a built-in CAN sniffer, as does ECU Master. So there's a couple of them. PCAN is another product that's standalone. So basically what it does is it allows you to wire into the CAN bus, remembering that the CAN bus is just a 2-wire bus, CAN high and CAN low, and then we'll be able to see a scrolling list of CAN messages, the identifier or address that the message is on, and then all of the data across the 8 bytes of data that are coming in. So from there, it's a case of then decoding what's happening and where, and that can be a little bit tricky. Generally, what I do is start by unplugging the device I'm interested in. Let's say, for example, we want to decode engine coolant temperature or the throttle position signal. What we could do is unplug that particular sensor, the TPS or the coolant temp, and what we're looking for is to see what particular message disappears or changes when we do that. And being a little bit careful and trying this a few times, we'll be able to see which message changes when we do that. Then, for example, with our throttle position sensor, once we've kind of figured out whereabouts it is, we can move the throttle through its range and we should see that message change. And we can narrow in on the bytes of information that are representing throttle position, and then we need to go through some scaling. So basically we want to look at the hexadecimal value and relate that to our actual throttle position. Normally I'll use a diagnostic scan tool to see what the TPS value is that's being sent out, relate that to the CAN message, and then do the same at wide open throttle. It sounds complicated and it does take a little bit to get your head around, but it is actually not too tricky. Once you've got a process to go through, if you do want to learn more, we do have our CAN bus decoded course, which covers everything that I've just talked about, obviously in a hell of a lot more detail, and we've got some worked examples in there on reverse engineering CAN bus messages. So if you want to learn more, check that out. Again, it's 50% off, and the team can chuck a link in the chat for you to find that. That Drift Life has asked, hey team, I'm struggling to get an answer on how to wire up my alternator on my Nissan RB25. I removed the cluster for the digital display and would like to know what I need to do for the exciter wire. Okay, so it's been a while since I've wired up an alternator on an RB, but those are a relatively straightforward alternator. Generally, you'll have the main battery post on the alternator itself. That's the one with the large gauge wire running back to your battery. Then you'll have generally 3 terminals. There'll be ignition power, so that needs to have 12 volts when the ignition is in the on position. You'll have a sense wire, so that's how the alternator knows what it needs to do. The sense wire needs to be run back to the positive terminal on the battery, so it's actually getting a real understanding of what the voltage is at the battery at any time. And then the exciter wire, this is generally going to need to run through a lamp, and that's going to be your alternator warning lamp. So that needs to be run to ignition power as well. So ignition power through your lamp or your bulb, and then to your exciter wire. So that's necessary to actually get the alternator to start working. If you don't have that, the alternator will never start charging. Next question comes from Andrew, who's asked, how did you rate SVG's winning burnout for Supercars Australia? I gotta say, that was an all-time burnout. The dude is an absolute legend, and I think after that effort, maybe he should be looking at entering Summernats. And for those who maybe aren't in the Southern Hemisphere and have absolutely no idea what we're talking about, New Zealand driver who has won the Australian-based Supercars Championship this year, and the weekend was the final event. So, of course, everyone went out in style with a massive smoky burnout. Probably find it on Supercars Instagram if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what I'm talking about. Congratulations to Blair M, who is diving into our fabrication fundamentals course at 50% off. Great choice there, Blair, and happy fabricating. Dakar Shades has asked, hi, do you guys still have the engine dyno from back in the day? No, unfortunately we don't. We actually moved that on and sold it a couple of years back. For those who are wondering what I'm talking about here, we had what we called our remote practice dyno. It was a 20-foot container with a mainline engine dyno and a Toyota 1ZZ FE. People could remote in over the internet and actually learn to tune and practice tuning on that engine. We found that it was a little more difficult to get it in front of people than we'd expected, and essentially we had to make the hard call of whether we put our relatively limited resources behind continuing with that or making more courses. So unfortunately we did end up closing that down. Next question comes from Surya, who's asked, with a Gen 1 Series 1UZ-FE, what is a good manual swap to do for drifting application? Probably one of the easier ones for the 1UZ-FE would be the Supra W57, W58 boxes. There are, at least here in New Zealand, adapter bell housings that are relatively cheap and easy to get hold of. So that's really the hardest part normally with any gearbox conversion, is getting a good quality adapter bell housing that is going to be nice and true. And what I mean by this is it's really, really important that the input shaft runs absolutely concentric with the crankshaft center line. Even a few thousandths of an inch off center and you're going to end up with problems with input shaft seals, wearing, bearing failures, etc. The W57 and 58 are not maybe the most sophisticated boxes. They're pretty agricultural. The ratios aren't perfect, but they are reasonably strong and definitely well and truly capable of supporting the sort of power that a basic 1UZ-FE would be putting out. Josh has asked, pros and cons of an LSD and a mid-engined layout. I've seen guys running them on track who are militant for both. Okay, well, I mean, the LSD, limited slip differential, is really essential for making sure that on corner exit and mid-corner, you're not going to end up with the inside wheel, which is unloaded, spinning. Basically, with an open differential, the torque takes the path of least resistance. So if you are turning to the right, your inside wheel is relatively unweighted, and hence, if you're trying to put a lot of power down at corner exit, it's just going to end up spinning that inside wheel. So the limited slip differential does exactly what its name implies. It's going to prevent excessive differential speed and lock up when you apply power on that corner exit. Now, there are pros and cons with LSDs, and a lot of this comes down to the design of the limited slip differential, the ramp angles, the preload on it, because it's a fine line. If we've got the diff locking up too aggressively, that in itself can actually cause problems, particularly on turn-in if the differential is locked, which we'll see with a two-way differential, which tends to lock on overrun as well as on acceleration. What we end up with is a car that really doesn't want to turn into the corner. It acts a lot like a welded or a solid diff or a spool, for example. So this comes down to a lot to do with differential tuning, but I mean, essentially you won't find, Josh, anyone going really, really fast on a racetrack without an LSD if they are allowed to use one. They're definitely the way forward, but it is a bit of a learning curve. I'll give you a quick example. One of our Toyota 86 development cars, we put a Cusco clutch plate LSD in that, and what I was actually finding is through a very long, reasonably fast corner at our local racetrack, as you were sort of in and out of the throttle, the car would actually start to push wide as you were just applying throttle, and that was because the diff was locking up too aggressively. You'd lift off the throttle, the diff would open because it's a 1.5-way LSD, meaning that the locking action on overrun is not as aggressive. The nose would sort of tuck into the corner again, and then you'd apply a little bit of throttle and it'd just start to push wide. And at that point, I was sort of thinking to myself, this is a step backwards significantly over the factory Toyota 86 Torsen LSD. However, we pulled it apart and deactivated a couple of plates on each side of the diff, essentially making it less aggressive. Absolutely transformed the handling. So for those who don't like LSDs, they probably had an experience like that where the diff simply hadn't been set up correctly. All right, congratulations there to Aidan from New Zealand, who's just grabbed the EFI Tuning Fundamentals course at 50% off. Congrats on that, Aidan. We know that you're going to love that course. Next question comes from Andrew P, who has asked, will you ever create a tuning module for Holley standalone ECUs? Yes, absolutely we will. This is one that we have been asked for a number of times. We've got a Holley unit sitting there on the shelf. We are just waiting for a suitable donor vehicle to get that into. So the answer is yes, we will. What I would point out though, and this is a question that we quite often get asked, will the course help me with my specific XYZ brand of ECU? And the answer is a resounding yes. Here is why. First of all, it doesn't matter whether you're tuning a 2-cylinder or a single-cylinder engine or a V12, V8, anything in between. The way the engine actually responds to fuel and ignition is always exactly the same. So if you understand that, you are able to apply that knowledge irrespective of the actual engine you want to tune. That's the first thing. Secondly, in almost the exact same way, the way the ECUs operate, the way they control fuel and ignition timing is very similar across all of the different brands. Yes, of course, the user interface is going to look different. The options in the different menus will differ a little bit, and some ECUs offer functions that others don't. But broadly speaking, the main core of the ECU, the fuel and the ignition timing control, these remain relatively consistent across different brands. So what I'm saying here is, with the likes of our EFI Tuning Fundamentals, our Understanding Air Fuel Ratio course, and then our practical standalone tuning course, even though right now we do not have a Holley worked example in there, I will 100% guarantee that it will help you get your Holley up and running. And hey, if it doesn't, remember, there's no risk here. All of our courses come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money back guarantee. Next question comes from Frank, who's asked, how do you incorporate VVT or variable valve timing tuning in the process of tuning an engine with a standalone ECU, as it does affect VE when the cams move? Yeah, Frank, you're absolutely right here, and it just adds essentially one more layer of complexity when it comes to our tuning. So I take this as becoming essentially an iterative approach. So what we're going to do is choose a particular cell that we are trying to optimize. And the process we go through is we will start by tuning the fuel, optimize that. We'll then optimize the ignition timing. And then what we'll do is make a change to our cam target. And when we do this, as you say, this will affect the volumetric efficiency of the engine, hopefully for the better, sometimes for the worse. And as we do this, that will then affect the optimal fueling and ignition timing for that cell. So basically we go through this circular process of fuel, ignition, valve timing, variable valve timing, and then come back fuel, ignition, variable valve timing. Now, it sounds like a lot of work, and it definitely does add a reasonable layer of complexity, as I mentioned. But the reality is that once you're familiar with this, there are common trends that we would expect to see with our valve timing. So for example, if we're looking at the valve timing map for an intake cam, now I'm going to expect that to be 0 or close to 0 around the idle areas. As we ramp up through the rev range, we're probably going to see the variable valve timing advance up to probably close to its maximum value. Maybe that'll be 30 to 40 degrees, and that'll probably be around about 3,000 to 4,000 RPM. As we then increase and go further in the RPM range, we will then see that retard back towards 0, because the general trend is that as we advance the cam timing, we favor low RPM performance, and as we retard the cam timing, we favor high RPM performance. The exhaust cam also has another layer of complexity here for engines that have dual variable cam control. The engine is generally less sensitive to exhaust cam timing than it is to intake cam timing for the aspects of performance, though, which we're obviously most interested in. If you do want to learn more about that, we do have a specific variable valve timing tuning course, which you can have a look at, and that's got a couple of worked examples in there as well. I think we've got one at the moment on Motec and one on the Haltech platform as well. But again, just like the answer to that last question on Holley, irrespective of what ECU you're tuning or engine you're tuning, that variable valve timing optimization course will help you out. And again, the team can chuck a link into the chat to help you there find that. Next question comes from Sean Smith, who's asked, a mid-engine turbo with an air-to-air intercooler that only has limited airflow from undercar duct. What would you say is the IAT limit before switching to a water to air intercooler? Sean's also mentioned he's a long time VIP member. Great to have you in the chat then, Sean. Okay, yeah, I mean, really, ideally, what I'd like to see is the air temperature within about 10 to 15 degrees C of ambient. So I'm talking here metric units. You can convert that to imperial if you prefer to work in Fahrenheit, but that's what I'm aiming for. So with a well-mounted air-to-air intercooler, hopefully at the front of the car, we'll get onto your problems in a second. If we've got a 25 degree C day, I would like to see the air temperature somewhere around about 35 degrees, probably no more than 40. Now, can we run hotter? Yeah, absolutely we can. As we run hotter, as our air temperature climbs, what we're going to do is find two problems. First of all, hot air is less dense, it contains less oxygen, so all things being equal, we're going to start to see our power dive away. The other thing as well is that it is increasing our inlet charge temperature, and this can in some instances make the engine more prone to knock. So that's going to require some real careful tuning with your ignition timing, maybe retarding that ignition timing for safety. And this sort of has a double whammy effect in that it also goes further towards reducing your power. So if you're significantly above that 10 to 15 degrees C range, then I would strongly suggest it might be time to look at your options. I get it though, mid-engine cars are notoriously difficult to get air-to-air intercoolers to work well unless you can duct them from the side. So air to water might be worth a look in your particular application. Right, welcome to the team to Hunter Alexander, who's grabbed our diesel tuning fundamentals course earlier in the day. Great to have you on board there, Hunter. We know you're going to love that course. And remember, all of those courses, Cyber Monday, 50% off. Next question comes from B-Shoot, who's asked, I have a non-AVCS WRX and I'm building a new motor that's going to be running on a Haltech 2500 Elite. How much of a difference does using single or dual variable cam timing heads make in power and turbo spool time? Significant is the answer. The single AVCS or single variable valve timing head combo where the inlet cams are variable, that would probably be, if you've got the option of one or nothing, then I'd go there. Obviously dual variable cam control gives you a little bit more flexibility again. But yeah, I remember distinctly going through the period where manufacturers were starting to add variable cam control to engines. So this would probably be maybe late 90s, early 2000s. And at the time, the ECU manufacturers hadn't really got their heads around how to control this. So a lot of the ECUs that were common at the time just didn't have variable valve timing support. And I know that a couple of manufacturers were basically telling tuners, hey, look, it doesn't really matter. It's just for emissions. It's not going to make much difference. And that was completely wrong. Nowadays, if you end up running an engine that has variable cam control and you don't utilize it, and then you overlaid it with the same engine properly tuned with the variable valve timing, the amount of additional power and torque in the low RPM range, as well as turbo boost response, it is night and day. So absolutely, the technology is really powerful. There are caveats to this though. So as we start building more powerful engines that have more aggressive cams with much more lift and duration, we do get to a point where it limits how much we can actually swing or move the cam to the point that the variable cam control becomes less useful. And usually those sorts of engines are only running in a relatively sort of narrow power band right up the top of the rev range. And under those conditions, the variable valve timing is certainly not as useful. But for a lightly through to moderately modified vehicle, then absolutely variable cam control is really powerful. Next question comes from Garage Guru TV, who's asked, any updates on the E46 ABS unit and the FJ? Any tips on where to get that system and the integration? The update, actually, interesting you asked this, the yaw sensor, which I was waiting on, actually arrived from the US today. So we had everything else for it. We were just waiting on that yaw sensor. For those who have no idea what we're talking about here, we're building an FJ40 Toyota classic truck sort of resto mod here at HPA Labs. And we are going to try out the MK60 ABS unit, which is a standalone ABS unit that's become quite popular for swaps into track day cars. Have a search on the internet, there's plenty of information out there about people using this. So we're not too sure how well that's going to work out. Obviously, it needs to be treated with a little bit of care because it is a mission critical element of the vehicle. But you know, we've seen a lot of evidence of people that have had great success with this, so we're prepared to test it out under controlled conditions and make sure for ourselves that we're happy with it. The units basically can be bought out of a range of BMWs around that era. I don't have all of the details, and unfortunately right now the name of the company that we purchased the unit from eludes me, so I am sorry. Probably I'll see if maybe our team can have a bit of a look in the background and see if they can find a contact for that. But if you spend a bit of time Googling MK60 ABS standalone, there's only a couple of companies supplying those parts, so you'll probably be able to find that without too much trouble. The actual parts you could buy from any wrecker, but the benefit of the company we dealt with was that it could supply brand new connector bodies for all of the sensors and the ABS computer, which means that we could then make our own harness for it rather than cutting up and relying on a modified factory harness. Cooley has asked, since the input to an ethanol content sensor can be skewed by water content, how can it still be used accurately to make boost fuel and ignition compensations? Yeah, look, I've heard this argument a number of times, and absolutely, if you pour water through the sensor, it's going to read 100% ethanol. It is not actually an ethanol content sensor as such. However, it just so happens that the varying content of ethanol in the fuel will work with the sensor to give us the results that we want. So yeah, water content, yeah, it's going to skew your ethanol content results. My argument to that is I would not be trying to run my engine on water. Now, yes, I understand the argument that ethanol is by its very nature hygroscopic, which means that it will absorb moisture content from the atmosphere. The amount of water that you're likely to get into your fuel before you have much more significant issues than the water content changing the ethanol content reading to your ECU, I just don't see that being a big issue. There are considerations when you are living in a very humid area in the world with ethanol fuel, and that's what you want to run, and it does require a little bit more management than if you're running on pump gas. Understanding the requirements of the fuel, understanding how to manage using that fuel, those are the most important things. If you do that, water content in your fuel should not be an issue, hence the argument sort of becomes a little bit moot, really. Congratulations there to Chance, who's grabbed our engine building starter package. These packages, we offer them for engine building, for wiring and for tuning, are a package of our most popular courses that cover everything that you need to know. In this case, from engine building right through cleaning the block through to actually degreeing in your cam. Again, the packages are at 50% off, and you can check those all out at hpacademy.com. Next question comes from John, who's asked, I haven't found much information and was wondering if there is a way to run 2 air intake temperature sensors specifically on an AEM Infinity. John, I'd be stretching my memory back a fair way now. It has been a while since I've used the AEM Infinity. We had one running in our 350Z, which we created a lot of course content and webinar content around. I had no need or reason there to run 2 temperature sensors. So I can't speak specifically for the AEM because it's not fresh on my mind. Usually you could dedicate another analog temperature sensor input to a secondary air temp sensor, but the problem would be, what are you using that for? Most ECUs would not have a logic or function that would allow you to bias or average between 2 temperature sensors. So you'd basically be using one for the actual temperature sensor the ECU is using for fuel and ignition strategies, and then the other one could be used for data logging purposes. But without knowing a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve with that, I can't really give you much more guidance there. Sorry, John. Okay, our next question comes from Mantis, who has asked, could you please give some info on how to tune the fuel map without a dyno and if it's possible for the average DIY enthusiast. Yeah, absolutely it is. I actually spent the first couple of years of my tuning career where I didn't have access to my own dyno. I didn't have the money to purchase a dyno, and there were really limited numbers of dynos where I was operating. So over that time, I basically taught myself the skills required to tune the fueling and the ignition timing, for that matter, out on the open road without the use of a dyno. So the process we use here is we've got a three-dimensional table for our fuel and ignition, and what we really want to be able to do is move through that table really accurately, getting ourselves into the center of a cell, leaving it there for enough time for our air-fuel ratio to stabilize, and then making changes. And this is what we call on the dyno steady-state tuning. Now on the dyno, we're using the dyno brake or load cell to apply enough resistance to the car or the engine, if it's on an engine dyno, to stop the RPM increasing and hold the RPM consistent irrespective of what we do on the throttle. We could be at 10% throttle or go to 100% throttle, and the dyno just simply applies more resistance to hold the RPM consistent. And this allows us to move vertically up and down our fuel or ignition column. So nice and easy on the dyno. On the road, a little bit trickier. What we can do here is use a technique called left foot braking. And what we're doing is applying load with our left foot on the brake pedal. And it does take a little while to master this skill because we don't normally have the sensitivity or dexterity in our left foot to properly modulate the brake pedal. But once you get used to it, you can essentially manipulate the amount of brake and throttle you're applying to move really accurately through the cells, much like we can on the dyno. Now, a word of caution here, obviously if we're using our left foot on the brake, we are going to be building heat in the brakes. So this needs to be understood and managed, and generally this process requires periods of tuning and then periods of cruising with our foot off the brake to allow those temperatures to come back down to a normal operating temperature. The other element we're using here when we're road tuning is a lot of reliance on data analysis, particularly when we get through to doing wide open throttle acceleration runs. We want to be watching the air-fuel ratio meter just out of our peripheral vision. Obviously we want to control the car first and foremost, and we're data logging everything so that we can then stop on the side of the road and make the appropriate adjustments. Now, most people think that tuning on the dyno is the only way we should tune, and certainly it makes our life easier because it's nice and safe, it's repeatable, and we don't have to worry about other cars on the road. However, one real big advantage with road tuning is that when we're out on the open road at 60 miles an hour, maybe 100 kilometers an hour, it's very difficult with a dyno to actually replicate the airflow and temperatures we see under those conditions. And what this can often show is when we get the car off the dyno, go out into the real world, we might see a subtle but measurable difference in our air-fuel ratio under the two conditions. When we're tuning out on the road, we're tuning under the actual conditions the engine's going to operate in. So very, very accurate way of tuning. And that's why even when I'm using our dyno, I always recommend taking the car out on the road or the racetrack when we're finished and data logging and just confirming everything we saw on the dyno still works out. Now, we do actually include a section on road tuning inside of our practical standalone and our practical reflash tuning courses for those who do not have access to a dyno. So we've got you covered in there. And another aspect, a way a lot of our members use that section of the course, if they don't have their own dyno, obviously renting dyno time can be expensive. So what they'll do is maybe after work or on the weekends, use a tank of fuel where their only cost really is that fuel. Use the Road Tuning Editions modules to help get their fueling and their ignition timing in the ballpark, and then hire just a couple of hours of dyno time to put the finishing touches on and really perfect the tune. So a very cost-effective way of tuning. The Maddie is asked, curious to hear your thoughts on EGTs versus individual cylinder air-fuel ratio. If you could have one or the other, which would you choose and why? And if so, would your answer change for fuel? Also, EMAP compensation for air-fuel ratio. Okay, I have had the benefit here of a couple of our development cars where we have had both individual cylinder EGT and air-fuel ratio. So I know firsthand the pros and cons of each. So first of all, EGT has for a long time been the go-to, and you'll see this in a lot of high-end drag cars. An individual cylinder exhaust gas temperature, usually an inch or two off the header flange, and the idea here is we're measuring the exhaust gas temperature and we're correlating that back to the charge temperature or combustion temperature, which is also affected by our air-fuel ratio. So people are basically inferring air-fuel ratio from the exhaust gas temperature, and they're using this to make modifications to the individual cylinder fuel delivery in order to try and stabilize the EGTs and make them the same across all of the cylinders. That's the theory. I've used it myself on a number of drag cars. It works to a degree. It does get the job done, and it's definitely better than nothing. However, the problem with this is that while the exhaust gas temperature is affected by air-fuel ratio, it's affected by other elements as well, which can basically make this a little bit less than perfect. For example, the distance of the exhaust gas temperature sensor from the exhaust valve, that will affect the EGT reading, as will how far the probe is inserted into the exhaust runner. Other elements such as the cooling flow through the engine will also affect the overall EGT reading, so it is not perfect. In the ideal world, I would always have individual cylinder air-fuel ratio O2 sensors. They are measuring the actual element we want to know, which is the lambda or air-fuel ratio. So no mistakes there. We're actually getting the data we want. So your other point here is on EMAP, or exhaust manifold pressure, and this is something that most people overlook. If you look at the technical documentation from Bosch on their lambda sensors, there is a compensation curve for how the lambda is affected by exhaust back pressure. Now, if we've got a single sensor post turbocharger in the exhaust, then generally back pressure can be ignored. In some instances, it still can get quite high if you've got restrictive mufflers, but most people will ignore this, and this generally works quite well. However, it's not uncommon with a turbocharged engine to find the exhaust back pressure pre-turbocharger could be as much as 1.5 to 2 times boost pressure. In other words, if you've got 30 psi of inlet pressure in your inlet manifold, you could have 40 to 60 psi of back pressure in the exhaust, and that will definitely skew your results. Now, there are ways of compensating. A lot of wideband controllers, you can input an exhaust back pressure sensor into them and they will compensate. If I remember correctly, I don't have it in front of me, I think Bosch's documentation still only compensates up to 1.5 bar or 22 psi, which is still really, really easy to exceed. So it's still questionable how well that compensation works. Getting down to brass tacks for me, I could not care less though. I do not compensate pre-turbo back pressure, and I really don't care if that lambda sensor is reading air-fuel ratio units or fluffy unicorns. I'm not looking at the specific number. What I'm trying to do is match across all 4, 6 or 8 cylinders so that I have the same reading. I'm actually still doing my overall fuel tuning with a post-turbo lambda sensor. So for me, the specifics of the number that the individual cylinder lambda sensors are reading are a little bit less relevant. So hopefully you can understand my take on that. All right, congratulations to Jacob Akuma, who has just grabbed that deal on our ethanol and flex fuel tuning course. Again, 50% off. Great way of learning about flex fuel tuning, which I know is a bit of a black art for a lot of people. Not a lot of information out there. This course is ideal if you want to perform flex fuel tuning. Next question comes from Andrew Welling, who's asked, interested in all-wheel drive drag car alignment settings and theories, DSM for reference. Okay, so I've got a bit of experience in this area, obviously with my background in Mitsubishi drag racing. What I always tried to do with my own car was run really close to zero toe. The reason for that is that basically any amount of toe that we've got will create scrub, and that can in turn end up affecting our terminal speed, basically slowing the car down. It is just harder to roll the car across the ground. And for the same reason or similar reason, we also want to run really close to zero camber as well. The reason for the zero camber is we want to get as much of that tire contact patch planted on the ground as possible. Now, The reality, however, is that when we're doing our static alignment, we're not really accounting for compliance in the bushes. So for my own drag car, we'd replaced all of the factory rubber bushes with spherical bearings or rod ends. There was very little compliance, so I could get away with running very close to zero toe. If you did that on a factory setup with rubber or even aftermarket urethane bushes, under load, everything's going to end up complying a little bit, moving or flexing, and you can find that your zero toe is likely to move to a toe out, for example, which can make the car a little bit difficult to control. It tends to dart and change direction, particularly over bumps. So what I would generally recommend is start with a small amount of toe in, because that is always safe. You can do this front and rear, probably somewhere around about 1 to 1.5 millimeters per side toe in. So that's going to be nice and safe. Test that and start trying by reducing the toe, maybe half a millimeter increments, and just that way you'll get a sense of how the car is handling, because obviously you want the thing to be safe. In terms of the camber, it's all well and good setting a static camber of 0, but again, there are camber gain curves for your suspension. What that means is as the suspension moves through bump and rebound travel, the camber will be changing. So what we did, because we had shock travel potentiometers on the Evo 9 drag car that I showed at the start of this, that held the world record, what we would actually do is when we were setting the toe and camber, we would actually purposely squat the car down into the same position it would be in during the launch, and generally what that would do is cause the rear to go into negative camber, and we would set 0 camber under those conditions. That gave us the best tire contact patch out of the hole, which is obviously where we want the most traction, and obviously as it goes down the track things will move around, but we're trying to basically make the best of a bad situation and get the best optimal settings, and that worked really well for us. All right, team, I am sorry, but we are running a little bit short on time here today. Someone's got to pick the kids up from school rather than leaving them on the side of the road all night. I'd get in trouble with the wife if I didn't do that. I'll go through 3 more questions before I do, and then we're unfortunately going to wrap it up, and I do apologize to those whose questions I haven't been able to get through to. First of those 3 comes from Justin, who's asked, running crank trigger off the flex plate versus the crank pulley, what works better? Absolutely no problem. There are a number of factory cars where the crank trigger essentially comes off the flex plate or the flywheel. Older Porsches, for example, don't know what the newer ones are running. And also even the Subaru FA20 that runs a separate plate that sandwiches between the crankshaft and the flywheel. So basically, as long as you're getting a clean trigger signal, absolutely no problem going off either of those. Next question comes from Gabriel, who's asked, for an engine with multi-throttles and boost, what mapping strategies can I use to ensure a smooth fuel curve? Alpha M plus map, are there any other options? Okay, so this one is actually one I covered in detail in a couple of our members' webinars quite a while ago on an RB26 Nissan GTR. So the problem is that in stock form, these engines run ITBs, individual throttle bodies, but of course they are boosted. Conventionally with a boosted engine, we would use manifold pressure as our load source for fuel and ignition, and that comes from a sensor that's measuring the manifold pressure post the single throttle body. That is great because the plenum does a really good job of averaging out the manifold pressure across all of the cylinders, so we can rely on that. When we're using individual throttle bodies, that's no longer the case. So we need to use alpha N or throttle position as our main load axis, but we do also need to use manifold pressure as an input here as well. There's a couple of ways of doing this. So the first is that most modern ECUs will use a background fuel compensation for manifold pressure. And the premise of this is that if we want to keep the same air-fuel ratio, let's say 14.5 to 1, if we double the manifold pressure from 100 kPa and we're 14.5 to 1 to 200 kPa, if we want to keep that same 14.5 to 1, we need to double the amount of fuel being delivered. So most ECUs now will have the ability to run this background compensation for manifold pressure automatically. So that helps us with this tuning strategy. However, the problem of course is that we don't probably want to run the same air fuel ratio at 1 bar of boost that we did at atmospheric conditions. So we then need a 4D compensation table over the top of this, and that 4D compensation table will be relative to manifold pressure. So we can add a percentage fueling as we increase the boost pressure to get our air fuel ratio where we want it. So that's one technique. On modern volumetric efficiency based ECUs, this actually gets a little bit easier because there's essentially an integration with our air fuel ratio target table. And what we would do is set our main VE table up with throttle position as the load axis. Our air fuel ratio target table would have manifold pressure as the load axis, and that just allows us to set our air fuel ratio targets relative to manifold pressure. As long as we've tuned the VE table accurately, then everything just works really, really nicely. I'll add one more subtle complexity here. This process that I've talked about, both options that I've just talked about there, work really, really nicely until we get to a point where we're pushing the turbos very, very hard and they start to become restrictive and choke. And what you can find is that while everything's been tracking nicely right through the rev range, as we start getting up in the boost at higher RPM and high boost, we can start seeing the air fuel ratio begin to taper too rich. And that's simply because the engine's volumetric efficiency is not tracking our expectations. It's falling away because the turbos are restrictive and choking. And under those conditions, again, a compensation table just in that high RPM, high manifold pressure area can help fix that problem. Right, welcome. We'll finish off by saying welcome there to Ryan Augustin, who has purchased our professional motorsport level wiring course. Now, I've already mentioned as we've gone through this a number of times that we've got a 50% off deal going on every single course for Cyber Monday. I just want to finish off briefly by talking about another deal that we've got as well that's going to be perfect if you have a real thirst for knowledge, and that is our VIP package. And our VIP package, if we just come across to my laptop screen for a moment, our VIP package is our ultimate motorsport education package. It's a little video that you can watch here, and this means that you'll never pay for another training course in your life. You get access to every single course we already offer. There's over 30 of them there at the moment, and you're going to get free access to every course we ever make in the future. You'll never pay for another course. Normally this package is $2,197 US. It's actually worth around $8,000 US worth of value. For our Cyber Monday deal, we are giving this at 50% off, offering this at not 50% off, $500 US off, $1,697 US. Now, I know that this represents amazing value for money. I also understand $1,697 US is a chunk of cash to come up with in one hit. We do offer a number of payment plan options on the VIP package, so you can break that down into monthly payments just to make it a little bit more affordable. Now, again, there is absolutely zero risk with purchasing, and it doesn't matter whether you pay in one lump sum or use a payment plan. There is a 60-day no questions asked money back guarantee. Also, if you use the payment plan, you don't need to wait until you've paid it off before you start learning. You get instant access to all of the course material. So I'll just quickly cover off what you get. So instant access to all of our courses, over 30 of them, all of our wiring, engine building, car setup and fabrication courses, access to all of our future courses. Now there is a list in here of our future courses that we have planned. We'll scroll down, they're all in there as well. And obviously this is always a moving target. We are always adding courses to this. You will also get lifetime access to our gold membership. That is our weekly or bi-weekly webinars that we run where we cover a specific engine building, tuning, wiring topic, and you can watch live, ask questions and get answers. Or as a gold member, you get access to our archive. We've got over 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. That will also give you access to our private members only forum, and this is the best place to get reliable and trustworthy answers to your specific questions. You'll also get a t-shirt and a sticker pack and we will send that out to you irrespective of where you are in the world. So total value on that package is $8,358 US. We are making this available for Cyber Monday. I think it has 24 hours left to go, so if you're on the fence, you will have to move quickly. $1,697 US. Again, we've got a range of payment plan options that you can see at checkout to basically break that down over several months and make it a little bit more affordable, but you do get instant access to every course